Hey everybody, so we are the Briar Woods Political Union, a non-partisan club led by students to encourage civic engagement by the youth and find common ground in our increasingly divisive political atmosphere. So usually we have meetings twice a month where we discuss a popular political topic and try to encourage people to speak up and voice their opinion. However, since schools have closed due to coronavirus, we decided to hold our meetings over Zoom and then record them so that we can share our thoughts with you guys. So please comment below, leave your thoughts, and hopefully we can start a nice discussion. So the first quick announcement. So like if restrictions loosen up, maybe like some campaigns will allow for like door knocking opportunities. But even if there are restrictions stay, I think campaigns will have like phone banking and other ways to volunteer and help out. So we'll keep you guys updated when it comes to that. So the topic we'll be talking about is the Constitution and moreover the modern day applications of the Constitution, how we're supposed to interpret them. And the overall theme will be like, is it ever okay to place limits on the Constitution, or do we have to stick to more of an original, strict constructionist point of view? So Abner.
All right. Yes, thank you. So let's first begin on the contextualization of the U.S. Constitution. Well, the U.S. Constitution was actually written to address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and it was written in 1787, but it was actually ratified completely by the 13 original colonies in 1790. One of the reasons it did take time is simply because of the fact that we had a Bill of Rights to be made, and that was because the anti-federalists, also the people such as Thomas Jefferson and George Mason, they particularly wanted the fact that certain rights have to be directly stated in the U.S. Constitution, and they did do that, and that's what we're going to be discussing mainly today, the First Amendments. And one of the more important topics of this U.S. Constitution is that slavery was actually abolished by the 13th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution. And now, in present day, there's been a great debate about the Second Amendment. So, according to the public, which is done by a poll by Gallup, approximately 67% of respondents said they would like some sort of gun control legislation. And according to Gilbert's Law Center, there are approximately 37,000 deaths, I apologize for that, per year by gun violence. And Mr. Scarborough, is there anything else you would like to say upon the analysis of this?
But just keep in mind that when it came to a Bill of Rights, one of the concerns, one of the conflicts was some of the framers were concerned that if they actually listed the specific rights, that would actually limit the rights that Americans would have. So one of the things that's important to remember is that the Constitution was created under the premise that people are born with unalienable rights, and one of the purposes of government is to protect those unalienable rights. So you had one group of people that said, if we don't have these rights actually enumerated, then what's going to prevent government from taking those rights from people? And another group said, well, if we enumerate these rights, are we really limiting the rights that Americans will have? So that was part of the controversy as well.
Thank you. Yes. So the First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech, the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Please. The Second Amendment states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed upon. Please. Now, the Fourth Amendment states that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And last but not least, the last constitutional amendment that we're going to be discussing is excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So I'd like to take this to Mrs. Scarborough. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we begin this discussion?
Well, another thing to keep in mind is that these amendments were all passed with limits on what the federal government could do. However, through what's known as the process of selective incorporation, the Supreme Court has made several rulings through the 14th Amendment that has taken some of the amendments and required the states to follow them as well.
Okay. So just a brief outline about the discussion. There'll be like a generic statement that's like an agree or disagree type, And if you agree, you can raise your hand to like speak up, because in this format it'll be a little bit different. And then last follow-up question. The whole point is to have a productive discussion, no demonizing someone for having a different opinion from you. And do your best to speak off facts and try to avoid using invalid statistics if you're not sure of the reliability of them. So the first agree versus disagree we have is regarding free speech, and whether I think that free speech should be absolute no matter what, and any restrictions on it would inhibit the free exchange of ideas and get in the way of truth. So in modern day, this kind of like applies to like hate speech laws or like other ideas that could kind of people fear could start restricting free speech. And since speech is like a fundamental aspect of our country, to become a pretty controversial topic. So how many of you guys agree with the statement above? Ayush, explain your position.
So I think it goes to a certain extent to what can be absolute when you voice your opinions, because I believe this country was founded on the core principle that everybody can have different opinions and voice them without feeling that others will see them in a different manner.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely when you talk about hate speech, you have to be careful with what you say, because some of that is offensive. And although you shouldn't voice it publicly, they are your opinions at the end of the day, right? And what this country is founded upon is that we all have our different opinions so that we can better ourselves, so we can voice our own opinions and see what do we need to pursue for a better future.
Right. I mean, the Supreme Court has put like a restriction like the clear and present danger test. So with the clear and present danger test, the Supreme Court kind of said that like the First Amendment can be restricted if speech is presenting a clear and present danger. So like if you're shouting like fire in a movie theater, then you're like that type of speech is not protected. And like in like Schenck versus US, it was like a specific situation where like he was like speaking up in terms of like saying things that I was trying to avoid people to join the draft, and that was interpreted by some people to think that like that could hurt us during the war and that could actually put our country in danger. So do you think like in those, like if it's gonna pose a danger to someone else or pose a danger to the country, like the Supreme Court has kind of established, but like do you kind of agree with that notion? Like
yeah,
that can be like a restriction on it?
Yeah, definitely, because propagating speech that might inflict danger to others, that wouldn't be what I think the First Amendment represents.
Right. So yeah, I think this question can be a little qualified more like outside of the clear and present danger test. Outside of that, is speech absolute? So Abner, you had something to say?
Yes, I do. I do very much agree with Ayush in this sense, because I do believe that the First Amendment is one of the most important amendments that the United States or any English common law has ever made. And one of the reasons for that is simply based on the fact that we've been so successful with this amendment. The fact that we have been able to have the civil rights movement, the fact that we've had the women's rights movement, the fact that we've had the U.S. Constitution that has been successful for hundreds of years at this point, is very important for me to say that, yes, this is extremely important to have the First Amendment. But as a matter of fact, there's also another constitutional, Supreme Court case that actually depicted the fact that there is a plausibility of the First Amendment being inhibited to an extent, and that was DC versus Heller, in I think 2008. Although that presided over gun rights, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia did state that every single, although that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, the Constitution isn't completely unlimited. And we can see that in the fact that we also have libel and slander laws to an extent where you can possibly sue people. So that's an inhibition. But in terms of hate speech, the debate is coming is coming to the fact that what is considered hate speech is.
Yeah, I think that the specificity there is probably the most important, so like we can figure out what we're kind of working with. So Lolita, what do you think?
I feel like once you start limiting speech, you start limiting people's ideas and like people being able to share those ideas. And I feel like there's like a big gray area, like not everything's black and white. So like if people do start limiting it based on what they think is wrong, I think that can create like a lot of controversy.
And something, Lolita actually points that out directly. Because you may have a different viewpoint does not particularly mean that it should be completely censored. And I think that's very important in the United States, because we were built on the principle of ideology that we need to continually debate the fact of certain situations. And that's why I greatly believe on the ideal of questioning in American history. And I think that's one of the reasons we've been very successful as a society as a whole.
Yeah. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Just keep in mind that when it comes to court cases, court decisions, Supreme Court decisions, the burden is on government to give a very narrowly tailored reason why a person or an organization's speech should be limited, not the other way around. So in other words, it's not up to us as Americans to ask for freedom of speech. We already have it. It's up to the government to prove a very narrowly tailored reason why it has to take that speech away. That's typically what the Supreme Court cases have ruled, whether they upheld the censorship or not, is that when government has to prove that burden, government has to prove the burden, and the burden has to be extremely narrowly tailored to fit that particular instance, applying censorship on freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Abner, take it away.
So the second statement we're going to be talking about is agree or disagree that the U.S. government should discontinue its surveillance programs because they infringe on the Fourth Amendment. So who agrees on that statement, please? I guess it's no one in this situation. So tell me why the people disagree on this.
So I disagree with this personally because I feel like the government is surveilling us through different technologies to protect us, because at the end of the day, they're monitoring various social media platforms and technological institutions to determine any credible threats against the American population. And if we were to discontinue that, we'd be opening up different sources of communication to plot terrorist activity against the American population.
So some would also say that, especially with Snowden's, leaking of the NSA documents, that the U.S. is spying on us without reasonable, doubt. And the reason stated is because of the fact that there's a place in Bluffdale, Utah, and I did a little bit of research on this, and they said that there's exabytes of data of American citizens' data that is stored there. 1 exabyte is approximately 1 billion gigabytes. And the fact is that they were very vague about exabytes. They didn't say exactly how many exabytes. Could show me that there's possibly something much more sinister. Would you not say that, Ayush?
There is a possibility that they are abusing some of their surveillance, but I believe at the end of the day, they're storing what they assess through their surveillance programs to determine any credible threats. For example, if you look at some random tweet on Twitter that shows that someone wants to harm another person, you can check their past data, search histories, different text messages from the past, just to see, do they pose a credible threat to another person?
Yes. So what about Lolita? What would you say on that?
I feel like everything is good in moderation. I feel like surveillance, it should be there for protection, but if they start going too far with it, like looking, like beyond the reasonable doubt thing, then it.
Normal citizens, you'd say, law-abiding citizens.
Yeah, I don't think it should be like heavily imposed on law-abiding citizens, but if there's reasonable doubt, then it should be like used.
So what about Vidya? Vidya, what do you think on this situation?
Sorry, give me a second. The cleaners were going ham in my house, so I had to outside. I definitely agree with Lolita. Everything is good in moderation, but when they abuse their power, then that's when it gets out of hand.
Yeah,
What does the Fourth Amendment require before a person's rights are no longer secured?
It's under the warrant.
Warrant. What does the Fourth Amendment require for a warrant?
Reasonable doubt.
Probable cause.
Probably, yes.
Okay, so basically the Fourth Amendment says that, yes, there's going to be times when government is going to be able to take a person's possessions or surveil a person's possessions. They don't use the word surveillance, but basically it says a person has a right to having those effects secure unless a warrant is issued, and that warrant has to have probable cause first.
Yes.
Well, I kind of have a question about that. So what about like social media and like ways the government have like looked at our internet usage and stuff like that? How does the warrant thing kind of work with that?
So basically that really hasn't been specified yet. That's one of the reasons why there's so many Fourth Amendment lawsuits right now. You know, how much responsibility do private organizations have to protect information? How much right does the government have to take it? I think generally speaking, when it comes to investigating crimes, of course, the government's goal is to get to the bottom of the crime, so they're going to push their ability as much as possible. So that's why it's important that power is divided between the executive branch and the judicial branch. So I don't really know when it comes to social media, internet searches and things like that. I do know that internet searches have been used as evidence in court cases. I don't know. I know that in Virginia, you know, we've heard that if a student's phone is taken, that the police do have the right to go through that phone. I don't know where the probable cause comes in, but I think they have to have some form of probable cause. I'm just not sure what it is before the warrant.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we do need surveillance programs in order to ensure public safety to an extent, especially with the history. This was really a response to 9/11, and that the when where a country's in danger, the government, to an extent, should be able to try and maintain public order and figure out where stop like violent acts before they start. So that's kind of like my take on it. All right. Is that it? Should we move on?
I think we should. I think it's been good.
Okay. Now I think this will probably be the most contentious part of the conversation, the Second Amendment and the back and forth conversation about it. So the first one we'll talk about is I think there was a study like saying like a good amount, like I think it's 90+% of Americans believe that there should be background checks, but still there is a good amount of debate from both sides, from people who part of the NRA and some parts of the Republican Party are still against background checks. And assault weapons bans, I don't think is as popular as background checks. There are more people against that. So who agrees with the statement that there should be some restrictions such as background checks and assault weapons to the Second Amendment in order to improve public safety?
All right, let me clarify something first. There already are required background checks, federal background checks. If a person goes to a licensed gun vendor and wants to purchase a firearm, they have to go through a federal background check already. Now, that doesn't apply to private sales. So when you hear people talk about universal background checks, what they mean is expanding the background checks from just licensed gun dealers to private sales as well. So right now, there's no federal law that requires a background check on private sales.
Yes.
Yeah.
The idea of expanding background checks would include that as well. So if, I want to sell a firearm to one of my friends, federally, my friend doesn't have time to go background check for that. If my friend walks into Loudon Guns in Leesburg and wants to buy a gun, he has to go through or she has to go through a background check first. So just make sure you're clear on that.
Yeah, and also with the assault weapons ban, the bill that's in Congress right now is a ban on assault weapon production. So the guns that are already there can still be sold and resold. The assault weapons already in circulation can still be sold and resold. It's just banning the production of future assault weapons, to add that clarification too. So knowing that now, I guess, who still agrees with the statement?
To an extent.
Okay, we start with Lolita, then we can go to Ayush.
So I'm not like too educated on the assault weapon part of it yet, but for the background checks, I think it should be made universal just because it promotes safety a little bit more. And even if people are selling privately, I feel like they should still go through a background check and still have the same and still be held to the same standards as people buying from licensed gun dealers, because it prevents a lot of like bad people buying guns, which is the problem that people are seeing right now.
Ayush?
Yeah, I agree with Lolita on that, because if you go buy a gun privately right now and you don't have to go through a background check, you can go on eBay and probably buy a gun from somebody and they won't know who you are. They don't know who they're selling their gun to. So they don't know if that gun will pose any harm to the public, right? So if we put universal background checks in place, then we can make sure that that gun that's being sold on a public platform privately by an individual, it won't be used for any harm.
Okay. But like, I think just to pose a counter, what some people argue is that like the specific wording of the Second Amendment is like the right to bear arms shall not be infringed upon. And then when you think of like what the word infringe means, so kind of like a background check on like a normal civilian trying to sell a gun to his friend, that might be like a burden, some would say. So how would you guys respond to that?
I feel like it's less about the rights and more about the safety in this case, because it's not like they're right. If they have a good background and they have reason to buy a gun, it's not like their rights are being infringed upon. I feel like that argument, it promotes, I don't know, like I feel like it's arguing for people who are trying to use it for harm.
Okay, yeah, like if you have nothing to hide, then like why can't you go through the check as well? What do you think?
Well, in my opinion, I do think there should be a level of background checks that have to be taken. I think the average time it takes for an NICS background check to actually pass through is approximately, I think, it's not that long. It only takes a couple of minutes to go through. Well, it is known as an instant background check, but I think we need to advance that in that situation. We need to make it a little bit longer, more lengthy, in the fact that we need to be more arduous in the process. We can't just hand people. In this situation, it's not particularly handing people guns, but I think we're plausibly doing that to an extent. And same thing with you said that the problem with background check is that maybe that a person has committed a crime in a sense. Maybe he did do a hit and run, but but since he does have the Second Amendment right, according to the U.S. Constitution, that he should gain the gun to protect himself. That's where I come down to, like, which type of crimes should we be giving people the right to bear arms? Because most criminals, when they actually go through the background check, they don't pass, especially felons. They don't particularly pass, from what I've read. But one thing I'd like to also put in is that the almost 60% of gun deaths that have occurred, which are almost 37, which are 37, around 20,000 or 37,000, is due to suicides. And I think the main underlying situation here is how are we going to cause mental health reform in the United States? There's many different theories on which laws we could possibly pass to allow mental health, but I also at the same time believe that there should be a mental health professional, especially in terms of possibly mentally ill patients trying to get weapons. They should be deemed healthy enough to suit themselves. I mean, to be able to purchase the gun and use it in a responsible manner.
Keep in mind too that I know you said that we don't live in a society now where people have to defend themselves, but remember, tens of thousands of people defend themselves with firearms every year still.
Mm-hmm. But I understand where Ayush is coming from, because we at the time did very much need the Second Amendment, especially in terms of the fact that there was enemies all around us. We had the British, the Canadians were basic at the time. Around, I think we're actually controlled by the British Empire. So at the time, we did, to an extent, need the Second Amendment. But I do believe that we must be able to preserve the Second Amendment, because I think it's still highly important in the United States.
Mr. Scarborough, do you know of any other arguments against expanding background checks from federals to like private sales as well?
Well, the biggest argument I think that I hear often is that you can pass as many laws as you want, that's not going to keep criminals from committing crimes. So even if we expand background, I mean, I don't know what percentage of gun sales or gun transfers, I should say, occur as private sales versus people going through criminal background checks at gun shows, or sorry, not gun shows, like gun vendors. But the reality is that there's already 300 million guns, they estimate, in America today. So by making it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to get firearms isn't going to change the fact that people who are not law-abiding citizens either already have the guns or will continue to get guns. So that's another argument, is that should the burden really be put on law-abiding citizens versus really trying to get at the root of what's causing so much gun violence? Sort of like the idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You've got a small segment of the population that kills people with guns. Obviously, they're criminals, but the vast majority of people who purchase guns and own guns are responsible gun owners. Why should they be penalized? Why should their rights be limited because of the criminality of others? So that's another argument for not expanding the background check.
Mm-hmm.
So people would kind of say, like, even if you expand it to private transfers, like, people will still, like, sell it to other people without going to the background check. Yeah, I mean, I think that really just comes down to, like, something, like, at least we're doing something to try to help it, versus sure, that something you may be trying to do something to help, but that is then putting a burden on people who are actually law-abiding citizens. So I guess that's where the conflict comes. Abner, you had something to say?
And by the way, so approximately 40%, like, we're going to take out the suicides in this situation because I think that's more of a mental health issue, but around 40% of gun violence, which are gun homicides and mass shoot, and also including, the thing is that there's no legal definition of mass shooting, so I'm not going to particularly put in that, but 40% of those gun deaths, which is around 15,000, are actually done with illegal or illicit weapons. So due to that fact, I think, and also 30%, an extra 30% are done because of gun transfers that, again, aren't actually able to be counted for simply because of the fact that, we don't have a system that is in place. And also, if I want to give a gun to another person, I don't particularly need to tell anyone, except that business could be between him and I, or he or she, whatever it is, that it doesn't have to particularly matter to that. So I think the fact is, how are we going to be able to reinforce the fact that we need these transfer laws to be much more strengthened? That's my question.
Yeah, when you actually implement the background check, only time will tell, like, if it gets passed, like, the implementation aspect and how that'll actually be carried out by the federal government. Vidya, do you have anything to add?
I definitely think I agree with Ayush, because another aspect of it is, like, the technology of guns has improved, like, so much. Like, they're a lot more automatic, and I think, like, when it comes to, like, infringing on their rights and everything like that, I do think that the laws need to be, like, adapted to the times as well. As for the argument that Mr. Scarborough said about, like, it really is more people that are misusing the guns that are obtaining them illegally, is there, like, another proposed reform to that? Because I think if we do what we can, like, then at least some people are saved. Because I think I just looked it up, and the guy, I forgot which school it was, but there was this Florida school shooting back in, like, 2018. That was he obtained his guns legally. So I don't know. We'll still be able to stop at least a percentage of the people that are, like, dying from people abusing guns if we have some sort of reforms in place. Like, I don't think just saying, oh, well, they're going to do it anyway, that's not, like, I don't think that that's the best argument, because I don't know. Like, I just think if we can do what we can to save people, then that's what's most important.
So Vidya, you just said he obtained his gun legally, so he passed the background check.
Mm-hmm.
So how would expanding background checks have stopped that then?
I just looked at it and he said he got it legally, so I'm not gonna pretend like I'm more educated than that. But I think it's like being stricter maybe if they have a criminal history and evaluating what kind of crimes they committed, as well as the mental health screening. I don't know. I'm not gonna like argue super vehemently because I'm not the most educated either, but I guess that's just what I have to say.
One of the questions I always have when I hear people talk about mental health is a pretty broad spectrum. So when I hear people say that, you shouldn't, that one of the limits to purchasing a gun legally would be passing mental health, would that be depression, anxiety? Would that be, schizophrenia? Would it be violent mental behavior? What would be the, if you're taking like a antidepressant, does that mean you can't purchase a gun? So I'm not directing this at you, Vinny. I've always wondered when people say that mental health should be part of it. It makes sense. That's right. But I think when you delve down to it, there are lots of people who go to counseling for one reason or another at some point in their lives. Would they then be limited on purchasing a firearm?
Yeah, the specifics are really how I feel like the specifics are the most important part when it comes to this. And like with that guy, like maybe like you can revamp the background check system, make it more updated, make it more advanced to like track, like especially with the mental health thing, find like maybe like specific diseases, find ways to be a little bit more specific, because like Mr. Scarborough said, it is very, very broad. So how you would actually go about doing that will be interesting. But I think we can all agree like there is a need there to help try to stop people who could be a danger to themselves and others from buying guns.
Yes. And if you don't mind me adding, Ashwin, I think one proposed solution would be to possibly get a physician's order. Not exactly a medical physician order, but mental health professionals' orders say, yes, he's able to obtain a gun legally through that situation.
Yeah, I think that could be a pretty...
I think we could, and by the way, if, I know this some conservatives might be saying, but that could possibly infringe. Not particularly. I think that if we have, one thing is that we could possibly go to a mental health professional. I think all of us at this point who go through a background check, we could possibly schedule a short appointment with a mental health professional. We can get the order from the mental health professional that we are not going to hurt ourselves or hurt anyone to get a gun. And then we were able to get a gun through a certain period of time as well. I think that's one way we could possibly enact the mental health reform aspect of it. But another mental health reform, I think we need, there's especially the pharmaceutical companies and also a lot of universities are doing research on particular psychedelics at this moment. And they're trying to figure out, is it possible for us to, because one of the reasons, again, mental illness is a big part in this situation. And as Mr. Scarborough stated, that there's many different mental illnesses. And based on the psychedelic research, we've seen that many mental illnesses can actually depreciate to can actually decrease simply because of the fact that they're being these psychedelics are being clinically used to improve the lives of patients. So I'd also like to put in a reform of mental health for universities, for especially research universities, to start actually doing research on psychedelics. That's what Jack and I, unfortunately he's not here because he's sick, have been doing quite a bit of research upon this as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think before we move on, I've just constitutionally with the Second Amendment, Mr. Scarborough, would background checks, could that fall under possibly violating the Second Amendment in like an interpretation?
Well, again, it comes down to the burden. So a lot of the recommendations that you guys are talking about, it would really depend on whether the court would see that as a burden on a person's liberty. So you want to remember that when it comes to the Constitution, it's designed in such a way that it is supposed to protect the unalienable rights of the individuals. And some of those unalienable rights are listed in the Bill of Rights, and among those is the Second Amendment. So the point is, and I think Ayush, in our class we talked about this, there are those people that believe in what's called a living, breathing Constitution.
Yeah.
That the Constitution needs to evolve with the times. And those would be people that would say that, well, you can either amend the Constitution, and if you can't amend the Constitution, well, then you have to have court decisions. We want justices that are going to apply the Constitution bend it, stretch it to fit today's society.
Mhm.
Then there are people who are what are known as originalists, and they say, no, that's the whole point of a constitution, is that it is supposed to be rigid, and that if you really want to change it, it has to be done in a very deliberative way, and that's through the amendment process. So the people who are originalists would say the whole point of a constitution is to protect rights of individuals. Once you say the constitution itself needs to be changed and shaped to fit today's needs and today's societies, whose? Are you talking about 51% of the populations and their views? Because if that's the threshold, then 49% of the population, their rights and their views aren't being reflected. So the purpose of a constitution compared to countries that don't have constitutions is that it is supposed to limit the government's actions against the rights of individuals. It's supposed to limit the actions of the mob, right? The majority will against the rights of the minority. That's the whole purpose of the Constitution. So what you guys are talking about is basically trying to do as much to the Second Amendment as possible without violating it. And that becomes tricky because the Second Amendment itself is pretty clear. You're born with the right to possess a firearm, right? It doesn't say you're born with the right to use that firearm to take someone's life. It doesn't say you're born with the right to threaten someone with that firearm to get what you want. So that's where the line comes into legal, responsible activity versus illegal activity. So when you talk about all of these requirements to get a firearm, whether it's expanding background checks, mental health evaluations, having a doctor sign off, what you're really saying is you're not really entitled to that firearm until you can prove this. You're not really entitled to this right until you can prove this. So that really is counter to what a constitution, our constitution, does. And again, a lot of people agree with you. A lot of people say, well, then, you know, in today's society, this is what we need to do. An originalist will say, well, that's fine. Then get what's necessary to amend the Constitution to change the Second Amendment. And if you can't do that, then you've got to address criminal behavior. You have to address criminal behavior as a result of mental health, not the rights that people are born with. Other people would say, well, no, you know, in today's society, when we have people, you know, high gun violence, we really need to address this problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up.
Yes.
Move on to the next one. So this one, I think there may be a little bit more consensus, like extreme measures such as like forced buybacks that some people have been proposing to ensure public safety, or that restrictions on like quantity of guns sold and produced. This kind of more, because like with background checks, that kind of like could be like, some people would say that violated the Second Amendment, others would say that it doesn't. These more like starkly contrast with the Second Amendment. So do any of you guys agree with these statements?
I mean, I agree with the first one, but the second one, I feel like we should clarify for the quantity of guns sold in a period of time. Is that for the general population, or is that to a specific individual?
Like maybe like setting limits on how much an individual can buy, or like setting a limit on like a company on how much they can produce or sell.
Right. I then agree with both of them. The first one, though, I feel like we should limit it to specific gun models, because I feel there's no need to buy back certain gun models, such as like a pistol that someone uses for recreational use, whereas you should buy back the assault rifles that pose threats to the general public.
Yeah, that's another thing I kind of had a question for Mr. Scarborough. Like regarding the range and the types of weapons, how do you really decide like which weapons are protected and which weapons aren't protected? Because like obviously like the machine guns and stuff like that have been banned for a while.
Well, machine guns, automatic machine guns, you have to already get a special license by the federal government. It's called a federal firearms license. That's the only way you can get a machine gun. But I think what Ayush is talking about, I assume Ayush, you're talking about like the AR-15?
Yeah.
All right, so
stuff like that.
The reality is that the largest percentage of guns that are used in gun crimes in America is a .22 pistol. So there are vastly more pistols used in gun crimes than there are with the AR. Second thing is, there are people who would make an argument that, you know, Ayush, I'm sorry, Ayush, I don't know, you didn't say this. There are some people that would say well, it doesn't really matter what kind of gun it is. I have a right to own it. In other words, I don't have to give a reason why I need this gun because, again, I'm born with the right to have that gun, and government has to make a good argument for me not having it. Obviously, a good argument is, well, you are a danger to society because of your illegal behavior, so therefore we're going to, limit your access to guns or whatever it is. So what this really comes down to, in my opinion, is not just the Second Amendment issue, but also a Fifth Amendment issue. So the Fifth Amendment says that you have the right to property, life, liberty, and property, and that government cannot take that right away from you without what's known as due process, right? So really the idea that the government can force you to turn over your property is more of a Fifth Amendment issue, not just a Second Amendment issue. Because the Constitution basically says the only time government can force you to do that is by giving you due process first. And typically due process applies to criminal activity. So the government can take your property away after you've been investigated, charged, and tried, and convicted of a crime, then government can take that away. So the idea of the controversy surrounding forced buybacks is, where's the due process? It's a Fifth Amendment issue.
Yeah, I think especially the Fifth Amendment, that the constitutional barrier that could really, because some of the buybacks that have been proposed are just like generic forced buybacks of everyone, so like including law-abiding citizens. So the Fifth Amendment could pose a pretty big roadblock to that. Lolita and Abner, what do you guys think?
In terms of forced buybacks, I'm actually very against it. I personally do not believe that the only people I think should be ever taken away their rights to guns, I think, are particularly felons with a history of committing crimes with extreme weapons, and they're not exactly given certain rights to guns, especially in terms of background checks, when the background checks do go through. But I do also believe the fact that this fact of the restrictions of quantity guns sold in a period of time, I don't particularly see how that's going to particularly help the American society at this moment, especially because how many guns can you particularly use in one moment to cause a mass shooting? It's not many people that are going to commit crimes aren't at the level of, they don't exactly have enough scientific knowledge to create a mass weapon through the amount of guns we're trying to talk, because I think that's what this is truly trying to imply, that just because you have 15 different AR-15 doesn't particularly make you more dangerous. It makes you more, more armed. It doesn't make you more dangerous. It makes you more armed. I think we need to be able to define those differences.
Yeah, I think that clarification is important, because there are a lot of gun enthusiasts that just like collecting guns, and that doesn't really make them any more of a threat. Lolita, what do you think?
I agree with Abner on most of what he said, because I think forced buybacks, it starts to get into other people's rights, and I think people shouldn't have their property taken away if there isn't a reason for it, if there isn't probable cause for it. And I think, like what Abner said with the quantity of guns, it's not gonna, I think there's a lot of reform that can solve a lot of issues with gun violence, but I don't think quantity of guns is going to necessarily help.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. I think we've kind of talked about all these issues. I remember Mrs. Scarborough was talking about the argument about how restrictions on guns will not work because criminals will still be able to get guns. That's obviously a popular argument. And whether the idea of the Second Amendment being outdated or not, obviously there'd have to be if people do believe it's outdated, there'd be a constitutional process of changing it. But I'm curious to wonder how many of you guys think the wording of the Constitution of the Second Amendment is outdated, and that there probably should be a Congress should probably try to propose a new amendment to change it.
Nope.
I think, Mrs. Scarborough, you're muted.
Sorry. Are you asking them how many of them think that the Second Amendment should be changed through another amendment?
Yeah. Do any of you guys think that?
Can we see the exact wording again on the Second Amendment?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. So yeah, well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
pay particular attention to that first clause, because a lot of you guys didn't really comment on that when you're talking about the Second Amendment. Pay close attention to what that the first two clauses really means.
The militia part, because it's kind of, no one's really talked about the necessity of a militia. That's not really dominating the public argument.
The second part especially, being necessary for the security of a free state. So think about what that means.
So to the ideology of a country or a state being, having a lower amount of plausibility of getting endangered by the U.S. from the corrupt government. Is that basically what it's trying to say? Because if we look at the quotes of Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, George Washington, they particularly do state that the United States government could one day plausibly become corrupt. And they faced that situation against the British government. The British government and King George III and his levying of taxes on in that sense, it was the colonial American days. So the colonial America. So I think that's one of the reasons I think they particularly talk about being necessary to the security of a free state and the right. And then they add in the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, which is also highly important. But again, when we look at there was a constitutional ruling, and as Mr. Scarborough stated, because of the judges, depending on the burden, again, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia did state that there are aspects of the Constitution that don't make it completely unlimited. Yes, it is the supreme law of the land, but the question is it completely unlimited? Because again, there's great amount of interpretation that goes into the Constitution.
Semantics.
There's great debate throughout history between strict constructionism and then loose interpretation. So I think to that extent, I don't particularly think there needs to be, based on the current rulings that have occurred with Supreme Court, I don't particularly think there needs to be a change to the Second Amendment. What I do think needs to happen is that, again, we need a greater deal of mental health reform. I think that will significantly change the whole debate in the United States of America based on gun control.
Yeah. To me, it kind of seems like, do we want to trust the judges and for them to make the interpretations on modern day applications of the Second Amendment, or do we want Congress and kind of like the people to take it in their own hands and re-clarify the wording?
Do any of you, I'm just curious, do any of you, and I know you're really young, so do any of you, because some people make the argument that the reason why we have a Second Amendment ultimately is to protect tyranny of the government.
Yes.
Right.
I think it's one of the.
So do any of you believe that a heavily armed society, the fact that there's 300 million guns in America, is a deterrent when it comes to what the government can ultimately do to its citizens? I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
In my opinion, yes. If we look at communist nations and also the Nazis, what they did, they heavily disarmed people that they didn't completely agree with. You look at Mao Zedong, people like to say, oh, he did give guns, he did arm some people, but he armed his own supporters. He didn't arm the people that were against him. And same thing with Hitler. He armed the Hitler Youth. That's who he armed, and the Gestapo, and the people that were in charge of that society. He didn't particularly arm, and he took the rights away from the civilians. And that's one of the reasons I think many of these dictatorial states were greatly misused. Simply, one is because of the ideology that was implemented. And number two, because of the fact that their right to bear arms was greatly, greatly, greatly inhibited.
Yeah, I think obviously it's asymmetric. The government has more weapons, has more destructive weapons. They have much bigger. They have tanks. So like if it turned into like a war between the government and the civilians, it's probably not going to be so well for the civilians. But people having guns in general, I think it is a deterrent to an extent. But like it's not like a complete. It's kind of like it helps a little bit, but like it's not like that. In terms of like protecting us in the end game of actually like protecting us against the government, I think it's just become too asymmetric that the government has much more capabilities.
I think one of the goals of the Second Amendment is, again, as the founding fathers always believed in a balance. in society, especially between the government and state. And I think that's one of the reasons the Constitution was founded, because if you look at the Articles of Confederation, the Articles of Confederation was greatly, greatly powerful into the state's hands. But thankfully, with the U.S. Constitution, they did place a little bit more power to, or comparatively much more power to the U.S. government. So I think they did want to balance things out. That's why I think they also added this amendment in. And I think the founding fathers were nothing short of geniuses. They were legitimately some of the smartest people that have ever been alive in history of itself. For them to create such laws that are implemented in such efficient and excellent ways is absolutely unfathomable to me.
Yeah. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay, we can. That's enough talking about guns. We'll move on to something else now. Abner, take it away.
All right, so the fourth statement is going to be about agree or disagree. I think that capital punishment is considered cruel and unusual punishment, and due to that, it should be made illegal. Who says?
Abner, before, can you elaborate more about the definition of capital punishment?
More so the ideology of the death penalty. That's what really is what they're talking about. Capital punishment in the United States is, in certain states is still legal. And California currently has a moratorium, which means they've stopped death penalties for a time being, but it's not completely illegal. They can reinstate it. So is there anyone who agrees or disagrees with this statement?
So would it be more like the federal government banning capital punishment, and all the states have to oblige to that?
To me?
No. Is that what the question? When it says capital punishment should be made illegal, made illegal by the federal government, and forcing all the states to ban capital punishment? Is that the question you're asking?
In the sense of the U.S. Constitution, because again, this U.S. Constitution is known as the supreme law of the land. So in that sense, it would most likely be a federal law.
Okay.
Yes. Please, Lolita.
Yeah, I feel I don't know, this is my opinion, but I don't think anyone should be subject to death based on what they did. Because I don't think, in my opinion, it's just not a fair punishment for any crime. I feel like jail time should be given, and it should be given based on what they did, to the extent of what needs to be done. But I don't think death should be given as a punishment to anyone.
Oh. So how about you, Ayush? What's your opinions?
I feel like we shouldn't be using the death penalty really, because you can't go back on the sentencing, right? After the sentence has been carried out, if it was a wrongful conviction, you can't fix that mistake, right? You've effectively killed somebody. Yeah, you've killed somebody for a crime they may or may not have committed. So I feel like you need to be careful with when you use it, definitely, because some crimes you can convict the felon completely for serial murders, right? But others, you don't know whether they actually did it based on some circumstantial evidence. And because of that faulty conviction, you may be killing an innocent man, which you can't take back.
Has that ever happened?
I believe it has a few times.
Daco versus Vanzetti, I believe.
Yeah, so there's an organization called the Innocence Project. They use DNA evidence to basically try and get prisoners, blanking on the word now, exonerated.
Yes.
And they have uncovered cases where the DNA evidence proves that the person couldn't have committed the crime and they've already been executed.
Yeah, and I think in New York, wasn't there a group in the 80s, a group of kids that were accused of murder, and they actually were innocent?
Oh, the Central Park Five.
Yeah, the Central Park Five, and
so it wasn't murder. That they were accused of raping a jogger. She survived, but none of them were actually killed. They were eventually exonerated.
Yeah, but some people were calling for the death penalty, and if
that's right,
God forbid that happened, that would have been very unfortunate.
And I can't remember. Sorry, I don't think New York had the death penalty at the time, if I remember correctly. So there were people that were calling for New York to bring the death penalty back for that particular case.
Yeah.
So how about you, Ashwin? What's your opinions on this, on the death penalty in itself?
I think Ayush brought up a really good point about obviously we have faith in our justice system, and I fully believe in it, but that does not mean that sometimes that there can be mistakes, and if there has been a miscarriage of justice and then the death penalty has been used, there really is no going back. So it's kind of, it's an uncomfortable topic,
Yes.
but the Ayusha's point really like makes it seem like the federal government should be allowed to restrict the death penalty within states. But I certainly understand the other argument.
So, in your opinion, Ashwin, based on this, what do you call, great amount of medical technology we have, especially in terms of, we have this new thing that was formed approximately in 2005, so 15 years ago, called single nucleotide polymorphism analysis. And the accuracy of those tests are almost 99.3%. That is very high.
What is it?
Single nucleotide polymorphism analysis.
What are they testing for?
They're testing for, well, it's basically like a gel electrophoresis exam in which so let me get into the biology of it. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. So there's approximately 99% of our DNA is similar to everyone, but there's usually this 1 to 2% of DNA that is unique to us, to our genetic code. And that's what they like to track. They want to see which DNA matches from there. They'll take the blood test based on the alibi and the DNA from there, and then they'll compare it to the evidential DNA that was found in the case, and then they compare from a gel electrophoresis test which one is similar. And they use that because of the fact that some smaller fragments go further because through a period of time, because they are smaller, they're lighter, and they're able to go, and larger fragments usually stay back.
Yeah. I mean, I think even if there has even no matter how much the technology has improved, like the justice system is not going to be perfect like an absolute 100% of the time. So I think something as severe as a death penalty, which can end someone's life, probably is still something to avoid.
Yes, I understand that argument, but many other people like to say this argument. They like to say that, isn't it as immoral as putting someone in a cage for, the whole rest of their life? What would your thought be on that to everyone? So I'll start with Ayush in this sense.
I mean, in a sense of cruelty between death penalty and life in prison, at the end of the day, life in prison, they're still alive, and although it does seem cruel and unfair, they have effectively committed a crime that has led to that sentence, right? They made their own circumstances that led to that conviction, right? They committed a crime so heinous that the judge needed to give them a life in sentence prison, right? But whereas the death penalty, it's definitely one of the more controversial sentences because it's just, at the end of the day, you can't take that back. Like I've already said, if you give them life in prison and they are found to be innocent later on through DNA evidence, you can give them their freedom back. There are cases where people who have been proven innocent after given lengthy prison sentences have been given compensation because of their prison time, right? Whereas with the death penalty, there's no way you can compensate that. So I feel like, yeah,
I think that the fact that like if you put them in life in prison, like the Innocence Project or something like that, down the line they could regain their freedom, whereas the death penalty, there is no going back.
So how about you, Lolita? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Ayush and Ashwin were saying, because death it's just so final. Like once you do it, it's done, and there's nothing you can do to account for their innocence if it's proven to be there. And I feel like a life sentence, if that's what it should be, if the crime was put up for that, then that's what should be given.
So, Mr. Scarborough, do you have any other lasting words for this slide?
I'm impressed with how reasonable all of your responses were. You guys are clearly, you've thought about a lot of this clearly, and it's good to see. I like how it was based on facts, even if they weren't all accurate. It's clear you're trying to make good arguments, which is good to see.
Do you know like is the arguments for like the death penalty just the pure like the justice system, like we have faith in the justice system that it's going to deliver the right outcome. So we should not really be questioning it. And kind of like, it's a little bit more older sentiment that like a murder or like rape is something that cannot be forgiven, and the death penalty is the only way for society to give like retribution.
I think a lot of it comes down to retribution for the victims.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I don't think you talked about was the morality of it. Some people will argue that they don't believe in the death penalty because they believe that the only person who can really take a life is God. So it's not really up to the state to decide that. Whereas other people, as you said, will say, well, we live in a state, we don't have a theocracy, there has to be an ultimate deterrent, and they believe the death penalty is it. Other people argue, well, there's not much evidence to support that the death penalty is a deterrent to some of the worst crimes.
All right. I think we can move on, Abner.
Yes, please. All right, so the last slideshow is going to be about agree or disagree. These are going to be two statements. I think that the government should be limiting the current protests in order to protect the communities from COVID-19. And I think that the dangers of COVID-19 outweigh the First Amendment right to protest.
So when you say the current protests, you're talking about the
George Floyd.
Okay, so you're not talking about the protests from several weeks ago.
Oh, what for stay-at-home, like
Right.
against stay-at-home orders in like Michigan and stuff like that. I mean, I think that can be two separate. Because I think this one is more wide scale.
Okay.
And throughout the country, but like that is it's the same idea. People coming together that could possibly be transmitting germs and stuff like that. So I think we can talk about. Let's talk about the the George Floyd and the police brutality protests first, and then we can try to compare it to that one.
So, Ashwin, could you please elaborate more on your opinion based on this?
So I think the protests have been like it's the people have the First Amendment right to protest,
Yes.
and that is such an like intrinsic part of standing up to the government and expressing your opinion, especially when something like a tragedy like George Floyd's murder happened, and especially in conjunction with the death of Breonna Taylor, the death of Ahmaud Arbery. So there is real pain in certain communities. So I think protests should be allowed. It's part of people's right to stand up to the government. And even though there is a government, there's a pandemic, there's a global pandemic, that is such a key civil liberty that I don't think the even though COVID is very dangerous, I don't think that's really a justification to take away and shut down protests.
So how about Ayush? What's your opinion?
I agree with Ashwin. We have the First Amendment right to protest against what we believe is wrong and voice our own opinions to the government. So I don't think that the government should be limiting the protest for the sake of COVID-19. I feel like that would just be a front for them trying to de-escalate the whole situation for them, for political gain. But I do feel like it is the responsibility of protest leaders to make sure that the way that they're conducting protests keeps the protesters safe, right? So I feel like instead of having one large protest, they should organize multiple small protests along different streets just to try to spread the people out. So you don't have a large group of protesters being able to possibly spread or catch the disease.
Mm-hmm.
I think with that though, the message they're trying to get across, they're trying to get as many people together in the same place at the same time as possible so that they can show their support for it. So I think having smaller protests, well, it's always good to also do that, but I think it's also going to diminish their message and what they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys think like the length of time plays a factor into this? Like a 1 week protest versus like a protest that's going on for like 2 or 3 months. Let's say this continues to go on. The health damages of the longer it goes, like the more and more the health damages will become. So do you think there's like a line that the government should draw that, all right, now this is kind of getting out of control? Are you sure, Lita?
So what you're asking is there a greater, so you're saying if there's evidence that there's a greater health threat if it continues more than a couple weeks, or are you just saying in general?
Yeah, like the aspect time will play into this. Like versus like, oh, like this has been going on for I think like a week or two, but like if we start getting evidence that the people coming together and congregating is resulting in a spike in COVID cases, and this is now going on for like 2 or 3 or 4 months, does there like a specific time where the opinion changes from it's okay and the civil liberty needs to be protected, or does that become like a public health crisis?
I think when we look at the U.S. Supreme Court, there have been cases where, at the moment, the U.S. Supreme Court does rule in favor for the governmental action, which could be considered unconstitutional to an extent. For example, Korematsu versus U.S. But over time, that ended up being known as a very highly unconstitutional ruling. But at the same time, I think it's very important for us to understand that the First Amendment is, again, very, very important in American society. It is legitimately the pillar of our society. It's one of the reasons we've been able to have so many effective protests. For example, Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington. The amount of progress we made because of that that highly peaceful protest is truly unsurmountable. And I think we need to be able to understand that. But at the same time, I myself am absolutely horrified by the fact that George Floyd was killed in that manner. But at the same time, in my opinion, especially in the situation that we are in, I think it's very smart what we have to do we have to be very, very careful on terms of our, communication with others. For example, I wouldn't particularly want to have the COVID-19 virus, not know about it, and then spread it to my family members who are of older age comparatively. And usually around, my father's he's above 50. And that's where the COVID-19 death rate does significantly rise up. Most, millennials won't exactly particularly feel the effect of the COVID-19 virus. But when it does go to their parents, their grandparents, that's when it gets very dangerous. And I think we need to also put that into account. So I agree with Ayush more so in the fact that I think we need smaller protests that encourage the ideology of social distancing, so we can so we can prevent the fact that we have a greater public health crisis.
And I think that's a good way to put it. Mr. Scarborough, do you have anything to add?
I'm just curious, did any of you, those of you that are seniors,
I don't think any of us are.
None of you guys are seniors?
Okay. No. Yeah.
So my daughter's a senior, so she did go to one of the protests, but one of the things that kind of surprised me, because basically how protests work in local communities is in most local communities, you have to have some type of permit.
Okay.
And what surprised me was if the county and the state was in a phase 1 stay-at-home order and didn't allow gatherings greater than 10, how are they giving out permits to protest? And yet, we couldn't have graduations, no sports, things like that. So I don't know what kind of like, some people look at that and they say, well, this is a little bit of hypocrisy. You've been telling us for 2.5 months that we have to stay home and it's dangerous if we get together in groups. And when people went out and protested the lockdown orders, they were demonized, they were called selfish. And here, 2.5 weeks later, you have people marching with some of the politicians. There was at least one school board member that marched in one of the rallies. So my question was, what I don't quite understand, if we're required by the state to stay home, then why is, the state and local governments tell us to stay home, then why is the local government also saying, I don't think that they actually had permits to protest, but I know that they did have the police protecting the protesters. So it was sanctioned, even if unofficially. So that was the only thing that kind of surprised me about it. But I think your answers were, again, very well thought out. Especially, Alita, what you said about the fact that, I hadn't thought about the fact that, of course, it's a protest. The more people that are there, possibly the stronger the message. So I really hadn't thought about it in that way. That makes sense. That makes total sense, though.
I think also when looking at it through like COVID-19 and all that, I think if the more the government does to suppress the protests, the angrier they're going to get and the worse it's going to get. And it's just going to make things worse. So I think that's what they're trying to do, letting people protest and letting people go out and do this even with the pandemic. I think it's going to help in the long run because people are going to feel heard.
Yeah, that actually, Mr. Scar, that kind of goes into like the thing we learned in comparative about like legitimacy and stability that like governments have to do, because like, we're like in a pretty peculiar situation on like how do we repress, do we allow it to go, which one will like help the government like in the long run. So it's interesting to think about which manner, because like if you let them continue to protest, they like eventually they may be more inclined to listen to the government a little bit later. But if the government started like trying to repress and trying to shut down, like Alita said, that's just gonna make people more angrier. So it's a delicate situation.
Yeah, they'll think the government's simply trying to de-escalate their voice.
Yeah.
They're gonna want to get more louder. I mean, that's legitimately how most people have an ideology. I mean, this is again rooted in American society. Do not try to shut us up, especially in terms of the fact that we're trying to talk about a situation and an issue that is very, very sad. The situation that occurred with George Floyd was nothing short of horrendous. And I think if the government starts to make those little ploys in which say, "Oh, these protests are horrible," horrible, they're simply just going to think about the fact that they're just simply trying to de-escalate, and Lidl was completely on the point on that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I think that's it. Thank you, all of you guys. Thank you, Mr. Scarborough, so much for joining and giving your expertise. It helped a lot with us trying to understand the situations going on right now.
You're welcome. When's the next one?
I mean, this is the last day of school, so it's kind of is. We can try doing stuff over the summer. I'll let you know. But,
okay, just send me an email.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and for those of you watching, leave a comment and we can try to start a discussion. All right.
It's been excellent. Thank you, Mr.
All right, good job, guys. Have a great summer.
You.